And good evening again to all my listeners. Dr. Abe back on the air. And this is the third installment of my series, Communication Heroes, in which I briefly profile my heroes of the act of communication. We've already looked at, in the first episode, Uncle Bud Robinson, the famous Nazarene evangelist. In episode 2 yesterday, we looked at the media ecologist and thought leader of his time, Neil Postman. And today, we're looking at a man from yet another walk of life. And that is probably my historical hero as well as my communication hero, a man by the name of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. And this is Chamberlain's book that he wrote called The Passing of the Armies. And this is a book that chronicles the last several months of the war, from, I believe, Petersburg up through the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. And it was interesting. It was actually Chamberlain who received the formal Confederate surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. Grant, of course, worked out the terms with Lee, but then when the Confederates went in to lay down their arms, Chamberlain was given the honor of receiving that surrender. He's probably best known, of course, for his bravery in the Battle of Gettysburg at an engagement called Little Round Top. And if you've seen the film Gettysburg, this battle is very prominently portrayed in that film. Jeff Daniels, of course, plays Chamberlain, does a remarkable job. It always struck me how Jeff Daniels, the Dumb and Dumber guy, Harry Dunn from Dumb and Dumber, could turn around and play such a serious role of the scholarly Joshua Chamberlain. But he does it exceptionally well, in my opinion. But for his actions that day on Little Round Top, Chamberlain was given the Medal of Honor. And you can read about that. I don't want to spend too much time on his war exploits because they're quite well known. But I will say my wife and I visited Gettysburg several years ago. It was the first time I had been back since I was quite young. And we were doing the self-driving tour around the perimeter of the battlefield, and we got to the area where Little Round Top was, and I told my wife, I said, I've got to get out here, and I have to go stand on Little Round Top, the top of Little Round Top, because Chamberlain was such a hero of mine, and for several reasons. Number one, Chamberlain is a testament to how powerful the act of communication can be. Now, most of us in our everyday life, we're not faced with battle. We are not faced with people shooting at us. The fate of the Union and an entire war hinging on what we do, decisions that we make. But communication is a tool that we can use in the struggle that is everyday life, and I think Chamberlain illustrates that. But let me talk briefly about a few things that may not be as well known about him. Chamberlain, of course, was dramatized by Jeff Daniels in Gettysburg, and he won the Congressional Medal of Honor for his, like I said, for his actions that day. But later in the war, at the Battle of Petersburg, or the Siege of Petersburg, near the end of the war, he was actually badly wounded to the point where they did not think he would survive. Actually, the New York Times printed Joshua Chamberlain's obituary because of how badly wounded he was. Miraculously, he survived, although the wound continued to bother him the rest of his life until he died in 1913. So he lived quite a few years after the war. And it is often believed that or he's often said to be kind of the last casualty of the war, because he died as a result of complications from the battle wound, even though he lived a good number of years after the war was over. Actually lived to be, for the time, quite elderly, lived to the age of 83. But he also, from 1867 to 1871, was governor of his home state of Maine. And then after he left the governor's mansion, he went to be president of his alma mater, Bowdoin College in Maine, and was president of Bowdoin College for several years as well. Before the war, Chamberlain had been a professor of rhetoric at Bowdoin College, which is one of the reasons I feel such a kinship with him, is he was essentially a professor of communication. Although he had taught, it is said that he taught every subject in the Bowdoin curriculum except for mathematics. So quite an interesting and just incredibly learned and scholarly individual who nevertheless performed very bravely in the war and performed very bravely in public service after the war. His memoir that I just showed you, The Passing of the Armies, is actually considered right up there with Ulysses S. Grant's memoirs and William Sherman's memoirs to be some of the finest memoirs ever written by a participant in the Civil War. And actually, if you have seen the Ken Burns Civil War documentary, much of the material toward the end of the documentary about the last few months of the war is based on the material in this book from Chamberlain's Passing of the Armies. So very learned, very scholarly man, but nonetheless one who was quite brave. He's a communication hero to me for several reasons. Number one, he literally, in my opinion, saved the Union with his actions at Little Round Top, which came down to communication that was clear and took place at the right time. Clear communication at the right time is critical to many, many things. And there was a point on the battlefield where during the Battle of Little Round Top where Chamberlain was about to be overrun, and he was told, do not retreat, because he was the extreme left. He was the left flank of the Union Army. Had the Confederates turned that flank, they would have gone by and they would have gone up over the hill and they would have attacked the rest of the Union Army from the rear, probably ending the battle, well, definitely ending the Battle of Gettysburg and perhaps the war, because the Union had suffered very crippling losses coming into Gettysburg at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. And Lincoln was really losing the Northern public in support for the war. And had that happened, I believe that the war would have ended soon after with a armistice and a recognition of Confederate victory. So Chamberlain literally had the Union in his hands that day, in my opinion. His troops were very low on ammunition, almost out, and they had endured attack after attack after attack from a group of Confederates from an Alabama regiment. They couldn't shoot anymore, but they couldn't retreat. And so Chamberlain issued one word: bayonets! And he yelled bayonets, and it's dramatized very well in the movie when Jeff Daniels says it. But it's interesting that the movie shows him explaining how he wanted it done and how exactly the bayonet charge was going to proceed. Now, what's interesting is historians who studied the battle and different accounts of the battle have said he never actually explained it. When he said bayonets, his men knew what that meant, and they immediately sprung into action. And so for him to be able to give one word and his men to understand something so complicated and execute it so flawlessly is a testament to his communication. The second reason that I think he is a hero of communication to me is that he used his communication skills in a number of different ways, obviously on the battlefield, but translated to politics. He ended up, like I said, being the governor of Maine. So public service as a politician, he had to use communication as a way of rallying his state, which wasn't an easy thing. After the war, you had soldiers returning from the front. The wounds of the war were still very fresh. Entire towns and villages had been wiped out. Yes, even in Maine, there's a story of, I believe it's the town of Deer Isle, Maine, where every fighting man between, I believe, the ages of 18 and 40 were killed. Not a one of them returned. And so Chamberlain, as governor, had a lot to deal with in the aftermath of the war, having suffered a wound himself, and wounds of battle himself. Went into public service and gave of himself selflessly in that way. And then after public service, takes a job as president of his alma mater. Interestingly, Robert E. Lee, after he retired from military service, took a university presidency as well. And so that part of it was not necessarily unique, but it did require him to exercise communication in a number of different ways, and to be able to put himself forward and be able to adapt, be able to put his war experiences behind him and communicate to people, both as a governor and then later as a university president. If you're interested in learning more about Chamberlain, of course, there's The Passing of the Armies, his book, but then there's this gem by a scholar by the name of Alice Raines Trulock, and it's called In the Hands of Providence, Joshua L. Chamberlain and the American Civil War. I like this book a lot, and it talks about he talks about Petersburg a great deal. Again, most of the emphasis on Joshua Chamberlain militarily comes as a result of Little Round Top, and perhaps justifiably so. But he was no less heroic at Petersburg, and Alice Trulock's book does a nice job of really chronicling his actions at Petersburg quite well. And there's also scholarship out there about the wound that he suffered at Petersburg and how severe it was. It was an abdominal wound, and an abdominal wound in those days was basically a death sentence. I mean, there was no recovering from an abdominal wound. However, Chamberlain miraculously did recover, and he again, he had experienced complications the rest of his life from it, but lived to a ripe old age, notwithstanding. And what's interesting is when the surgeon was working on him after his wound in Petersburg, the surgeon who was working on him was basically going to give up. There was no point in going further, and Chamberlain said, "No, keep going." And the surgeon was able to repair the wound as best he could, sewed him up, still figured that he would die, but he didn't. And it's that intestinal fortitude, that clarity. No, keep going. Or press on, or some such. I think he said press on, as in continue your work. And so that clarity, that grace under pressure, even facing death, is the main reason why Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain is my communication hero number 3. This is a 5-part series. Join me for part 4 on Monday. I'm not going to do a video tomorrow in observance of the Sabbath day, but join me on Monday for number 4. Have a great night.